News for you, you can't wake up and be Mad Dog Russo. You can't wake up and be Adam Shine. You can't wake up and be Stephen A. It takes work. In the end, we all have people to answer to.
Stephen A. Smith has finally snapped, publicly slamming Molly Qerim after she stunned ESPN by signing a massive new deal with NBC Sports. What looked like her biggest career win has now spiraled into a war of words, bruised egos, and a brewing media rivalry that could change the future of sports television forever. How did it get to this? Let's find out.
Molly is somebody that I have leaned on many occasions in the past, as she has done when it comes to me. We've been partners on the show for the last 10 years. And a lot of times some of these things happen and it's just uncomfortable to see.
Molly's abrupt exit that shook ESPN to its core. Stephen A. Smith has finally snapped. The man who once defended Molly Qerim, who praised her as a trusted partner for more than a decade, is now firing shots. And it's all because of her stunning new deal with NBC Sports. What was supposed to be a triumphant career move for Molly has instead turned into one of the messiest media feuds in recent sports history. And tonight, we're exposing how a longtime on-air partnership crumbled into bitterness, why Stephen A. is furious at Molly's leap to NBC, and the shocking industry secrets that ESPN tried to keep under wraps. This is not just about contracts, this is about power, about who gets to call the shots in sports media. And as you'll soon see, the most explosive details, the comments Stephen A. made that he thought the cameras would never catch, the whispers about Molly's real reasons for leaving ESPN, and the insider leaks about how NBC outbid the worldwide leader in sports, are still to come. But let's start with the moment everything changed. Molly's abrupt exit from First Take. Nobody expected it. She was hosting on a Monday morning. By Tuesday, she was gone. No farewell show, no goodbye to the fans, just a cold Instagram story and silence. Molly is somebody that I have leaned on many occasions in the past, as she has done when it comes to me. We've been partners on the show for the last 10 years, and a lot of times some of these things happen, and it's just uncomfortable to see. That was Stephen A. on the air, visibly shaken. But behind the scenes, insiders say he was angry, furious that the show he built had just lost its moderator without warning, and even more furious that ESPN executives seemed powerless to stop it. Now, if you believe the official line, it was just about money. Sports Business Journal reported that Molly declined a contract extension and chose to explore new opportunities. ESPN's president of content, Burke Magnus, said, "We were more focused on her deal running through the end of the year. The one thing that was unexpected was the timing of all this." But come on, timing doesn't explain why Molly walked out overnight. Timing doesn't explain why Stephen A., a man who brags about standing up for colleagues in contract talks, sounded so defensive when asked if he tried to keep her at ESPN. And timing definitely doesn't explain why NBC swooped in just weeks later with a multi-million DMN deal.
She said, ouch. I was like, wow. So obviously this is pretty obvious. At least from Molly's point of view, I don't think it was the most amicable split.
Let's be clear, Molly wasn't just leaving a job. She was escaping a system where Stephen A. makes $20 million a year while his co-hosts and moderators scrape by with a fraction of that. A system where, according to one commentator, when you pay Stephen A. Smith $20 million, whoever his co-host is going to want an exorbitant amount of money, and that's where the resentment began. When ESPN re-signed Malika Andrews, when Mina Kimes got a fresh deal worth nearly $2 million, when Shannon Sharpe was brought in with fanfare, Molly looked around and realized, I've been here for 10 years, I've carried this show through endless debates, and yet when it comes time for the network to invest in me, they lowball me. No send-off, no soft landing, just a brutal emergency exit, as one analyst put it, and yet ESPN tried to spin it. Magnus told The Athletic that Molly wanted to explore other things, and that her interests weren't aligned with the networks. But here's where things get messy. If this was all so professional, why did Stephen A. almost immediately go on his Sirius XM show and start talking about people forgetting they answer to somebody?
News for you, you can't wake up and be Mad Dog Russo. You can't wake up and be Adam Shine. You can't wake up and be Stephen A. It takes work. In the end, we all have people to answer to.
News for you. You can't wake up and be Mad Dog Russo. You can't wake up and be Adam Shine. You can't wake up and be Stephen A. It takes work. In the end, we all have people to answer to. Notice how he never says Molly's name. He keeps insisting, I'm not talking about her. But the subtext is obvious. Who else just walked away from ESPN over contract demands? Who else wanted a bigger platform? Who else challenged the idea that Stephen A. is untouchable? It was Molly. And the fact that he keeps denying denying it while continuing to hammer the point makes it even clearer. This wasn't just business, this was personal. And that brings us back to NBC, because here's the kicker. According to multiple reports, Molly already had interest from other networks while her ESPN contract was in limbo. One insider speculated, oh, she must already have a job lined up, and the job she has lined up must be some sort of competitor to ESPN. He was right. NBC Sports, desperate to revamp its morning programming and compete with ESPN's daily dominance, saw Molly as the perfect catch. A familiar face, proven ratings, and most importantly, someone who could bring credibility and stability to a network that has struggled to build a personality-driven debate show. Stephen A. knew it too. That's why the very same week her NBC deal was leaked. He pivoted his monologues into lectures about humility, value, and knowing your place. But to the audience, it sounded like shade, like a man who had just been blindsided by his own teammate. And honestly, who could blame Molly? After 10 years of cutting off egos, managing chaos on live TV, and being treated like an accessory to Stephen A's empire, she finally bet on herself, and NBC backed up the Brinks truck. But here's the most shocking part, and we'll dive deep into this later in the video. NBC didn't just offer her a seat at the table. They offered her power, executive producer credits, cross-platform projects, a chance to create shows under her own vision, things ESPN flat out refused to give her. So while Stephen A ranted about everyone has a boss and you can't define your own value, Molly was already sitting across the table from NBC executives writing her own terms. And that's when Stephen A lost it.
She said, out. I was like, wow. So obviously, this is pretty obvious. At least from Molly's point of view, I don't think it was the most amicable split.
The public didn't see the whole story. All they saw was Molly's polite farewell. After much reflection, I've decided it's time to close this incredible chapter and step away from First Take. Hosting this show has been one of the greatest honors of my career. It sounded gracious, even heartfelt, but insiders point to the real emotion, the frustration of being sidelined and underpaid, boiling beneath the surface. Because let's not sugarcoat it, ESPN has a history of undervaluing its female talent. Jamela Hill, Carrie Champion, Michelle Beadle, each one carried shows, each one drove ratings, and yet each one left under less than ideal terms. And now Molly joins that list. Meanwhile, Stephen A continues to tower over ESPN as its $20 million man. He has admitted, even bragged, that every morning he wakes up asking one thing: how do I get my bosses more money? How do I get some of it? That's his philosophy. Not how do I elevate my co-hosts, not how do I protect my team, but how do I make them money, and how do I grab my share? That's where Molly's decision stings him the most, because by leaving, by signing with NBC, she shattered the system that kept him at the center of the universe. She stopped playing by his rules, and the evidence is right there in his tone. On his radio show, he framed her exit as a lesson in humility, a warning to others in the industry. We don't get to define our own value. We don't get to define our own worth. We don't get to sit there and summarily say, this is who I am and this is what I'm going to do. Come on, who else could that possibly be about? This wasn't a general observation. It was a veiled jab, and the irony? This is the same Stephen A who spent years leveraging his own worth, forcing ESPN's hand until they made him the highest paid personality at the network. When he demanded money, it was business. When Molly pushed back, suddenly it was ego. That double standard is glaring.
We don't get to define our own value. We don't get to define our own worth. We don't get to sit there and summarily say, this is who I am and this is what I'm going to do.
Now, let's rewind to the weekend before her departure. According to Awful Announcing, Sports Business Journal first leaked that Molly would be leaving at the end of the year. But then, within 24 hours, she was gone. Insiders call it an emergency landing. This was an abrupt landing. This is an emergency exit. This is an emergency landing. The abruptness tells us everything. You don't walk off set mid-season during football season unless something major happened. And sources say that something was the NBC deal heating up faster than anyone expected. Think about it. If Molly was truly leaving on amicable terms, ESPN would have staged a farewell show. They would have milked the ratings. Instead, Stephen A was forced to break the news live, his voice cracking like a man blindsided. Am I going to share it with you? No, because again, that's her story to tell. But I do think it's important that I started off the show by just acknowledging my love and appreciation for her, and what she's meant to me, and what she's meant to the show. Notice the Paraphrasing, that's her story to tell. Translation, he knows the real reason. He knows it wasn't just about contracts, but he also knows saying it out loud would expose ESPN's dysfunction and his own role in it. And that brings us to the whisper. Did Molly leave to get away from Stephen A? It's a theory gaining traction. As one analyst bluntly said, when I look at the abrupt like, no, I'm not coming into work tomorrow, that also is like maybe there's pointing a finger at Stephen A. Smith. I mean, you can play it out to the end of the year and move on to your next deal, but when you don't come in, it makes me think maybe Stephen A. is a part of her frustration. This is crucial because for years, viewers speculated about tension between them. Molly moderating while Stephen A. steamrolled debates. Molly cutting him off when his rants went too long. Molly playing peacekeeper while egos clashed around her. But what if behind the scenes that tension boiled over? What if NBC wasn't just offering more money, but a fresh start far away from Stephen A.'s shadow? That would explain why she left so abruptly, why she skipped the goodbye, why her Instagram farewell didn't even mention Stephen A. by name. Think about that. 10 years of working side by side, and in her final words, she thanks the fans and the First Take family, but not him. Fans noticed, commentators noticed, and Stephen A. definitely noticed. And then came his response. Not direct, not explicit, but cutting all the same. He launched into lectures about leverage, about bosses, about knowing your worth. He used her exit as a cautionary tale, as if to say, see what happens when you overplay your hand. And in doing so, he revealed his hand, because Stephen A. Smith doesn't waste time on people he doesn't feel threatened by. So why does Molly's NBC deal rattle him so much? Because for the first time in years, ESPN's most powerful star looks like he's losing control of the narrative. And that's just the beginning.
When I look at the abrupt, like, nah, I'm not coming into work tomorrow.
Yeah.
That also is like, maybe there's pointing the finger at Stephen A. Smith. I mean, you can play it out to the end of the year and move on to your next deal. But when you don't come in, it makes me think maybe Stephen A. is a part of her frustration.
The NBC deal that sparked Stephen A.'s fury. Now, here's the truth ESPN didn't want you to know. The second Molly Qerim's departure leaked, NBC Sports was already deep in negotiations, and those talks weren't just about a bigger paycheck. They were about power, something ESPN was never going to give her. According to multiple reports, ESPN had penciled Molly in for other projects after removing her from First Take. Translation, they wanted to shuffle her into the background. Maybe a digital segment, maybe some sideline reporting, but not a platform on par with what Stephen A. enjoys. That's why her contract talks soured. ESPN executives made their usual calculation. She's not irreplaceable. She's not Stephen A. In fact, one commentator flat out said it. Now Molly is not Stephen A. Smith. They don't need her as much as you need Stephen A. But NBC saw things differently. Behind closed doors, they pitched Molly on something radical, a chance to not just host but to shape the programming itself, to build a new flagship morning show that could rival ESPN's dominance. And crucially, they offered her an executive producer title. That's leverage. That's ownership. ESPN never saw it coming. In fact, when Sports Business Journal first reported Molly would leave at the end of the year, insiders say ESPN believed they had time. Months to test out new moderators, months to phase her out gently, months to spin the story. But Molly pulled the trigger early, and in doing so, she robbed Stephen A. and ESPN of the farewell narrative they wanted to craft. But what really set off alarms inside ESPN headquarters was the speed with which NBC announced their interest. Within days, executives realized this wasn't just a talent exit, it was a coup. Now here's where Stephen A. enters the story again. Publicly, he played the role of the heartbroken colleague. He called Molly a friend, praised her professionalism, wished her the best. But behind closed doors, sources say he was furious, not just because she left, but because she left in a way that made him look powerless. Remember, Stephen A. prides himself on being the fixer, the guy who says he's fought for others' contracts, the man who brags about calling the shots, and yet one of his closest partners bolted and he couldn't stop it. So what did he do? He started sending messages in his monologues. And guess what? I don't give a DM what anybody say unless you have the leverage to do it. When you heard me at a time when we were discussing my contract negotiations all over the media and all throughout the sports world, what I talked about was what my worth was based on what the numbers show. I talked about these are the ratings, this is the revenue. That's not random. That's a man drawing a line in the sand. Translation, I've got leverage. Molly doesn't. I earned my deal. She didn't. But NBC didn't care about ESPN's hierarchy. They cared about optics. They cared about taking one of ESPN's most visible faces and planting her on their own network as proof they could compete. And make no mistake, this was about competition. NBC isn't just hiring a host. They're making a statement. A statement that says if ESPN won't value its talent, we will. Think about the timing. ESPN was in the middle of brutal layoffs, cutting high-profile names left and right. Analysts, play-by-play voices, studio hosts gone. Meanwhile, Stephen A. strutted around untouched with his massive contract. The optics were ugly, and then Molly left. What better way for NBC to seize the moment than to poach her and turn her into the face of their programming push? The irony, ESPN created this problem by lowballing her, by undervaluing her, by assuming she'd never leave. And here's the kicker, NBC didn't just offer her a raise, they offered her parity. Not Stephen A. money, but close enough to make a statement. Multiple insiders believe her new deal is structured to grow based on ratings, podcast expansion, and digital content. In other words, the exact opportunities ESPN refused to give her. That's why Stephen A. has been throwing shade ever since. Because deep down, he knows Molly got the one thing he can't control, freedom.
And guess what? I don't give a damn what anybody say unless you have the leverage to do it. When you heard me at a time when we were discussing my contract negotiations all over the media and all throughout the sports world, what I talked about was what my worth was based on what the numbers showed. I talked about these are the ratings, this is the revenue.
But here's where it gets even messier. Sources claim that in the days after Molly's exit, ESPN executives flooded Stephen A. with talking points. They wanted him to emphasize that this was her decision, that ESPN didn't want to lose her, and that she'd always be part of the family. And yes, he said all of that on air. But in the end, she made a decision to walk away from the show effective immediately. As you see from her Instagram post, that story is for her to tell. Do I have an idea? Of course I do. Am I going to share it with you? No, because again, that's her story to tell. Classic corporate spin. But fans weren't buying it. They saw through the vague statements. They saw Stephen A.'s carefully chosen words, and they connected the dots. Molly didn't just walk away. She walked into something better, and Stephen A., he was left fuming. Because here's the dirty little secret. When Molly Qerim signed that NBC deal, she did more than just upgrade her career. She put a crack in Stephen A.'s empire, a crack that no amount of money or monologues can fully patch. When news of Molly's NBC deal finally broke, the sports media world went into shock. Not because she found another job, everyone expected that eventually, but because of the size and speed of the deal. NBC didn't wait, they didn't hedge, they didn't test her out like ESPN planned to do with rotating moderators. They went all in. Industry insiders say the deal was worth well into the 7 figures, structured with performance escalators tied to ratings and digital expansion. That means Molly isn't just cashing a paycheck, she's betting on herself, knowing that if her new show succeeds, she gets paid like a franchise player. And here's the bombshell. Part of the deal reportedly includes cross-network opportunities, Olympic coverage, NFL features, even late-night crossovers. That's the kind of exposure that could elevate Molly from sports host to household name. Compare that to ESPN's offer, a modest raise, vague new projects, and no real creative control. They wanted to keep her in a box. NBC handed her the keys to the studio. No wonder she left without looking back.
But in the end, she made a decision to walk away from the show effective immediately. As you see from her Instagram post, that story is for her to tell. Do I have an idea? Of course I do. Am I going to share it with you? No. Because again, that's her story to tell.
But ESPN didn't take it quietly. According to multiple reports, the network scrambled to fill her role on First Take. Within days, executives launched what insiders called a casting carousel. Guest moderators rotated in. Andrews, Taylor Rooks, while ESPN quietly tested chemistry with Stephen A. It was chaos, and audiences noticed. Without Molly's steady hand, First Take felt off. The flow was different. The energy was messy. Stephen A. dominated, but the balance was gone. And that's when the narrative began to turn. Fans who once criticized Molly for interrupting suddenly realized how much she held the show together. Without her, debates spiraled. Segments dragged. The glue was gone. Meanwhile, NBC seized the PR moment. They positioned Molly as not just an addition, but as a victory. Their press release highlighted her decade of experience, her reputation as a stabilizing force, and her vision for building something fresh. It was a direct schmeat at ESPN, and Stephen A. felt it. Publicly, he tried to keep his cool. He spoke about Molly with affection. He said he was sad to see her go. But listen closely and you hear the bitterness creeping in. It was a contract negotiation that was going on. ESPN certainly did not want to lose her. But in the event, she made a decision to walk away from the show, effective immediately, as you see from her Instagram post. That last line, that story is for her to tell, is classic Stephen A. He's not saying it outright, but he's hinting. I know the real reason, and it's not the version you're hearing. And that's exactly what fuels the speculation. Did Molly leave because of money? Because of of power, or because she was simply tired of working under Stephen A's shadow. Some point to the timing. Just days before Molly's exit, Stephen A had been bragging on air about helping others get paid. Shannon Sharpe, Marcus Spears, even Pat McAfee. He painted himself as the kingmaker, the man who decides who eats. No wonder she walked. But the real blow came later. Off camera, insiders claim Stephen A exploded when he heard the details of Molly's NBC package. Not because of the money, but because of the title, executive producer. For a man who's fought his whole career to control his platform, seeing a former co-host leapfrog into a producer role at a rival network had to sting, especially when ESPN has never given him full control of First Take. That's why his SiriusXM rant hit so hard. He wasn't just speaking about business. He was speaking about Molly, about losing leverage, about watching someone else gain the freedom he covets. Because the truth is, Stephen A isn't used to losing control. He's the centerpiece of ESPN, the face of First Take, the man Disney bends over backwards to keep happy. And yet, here was Molly Qerim breaking free, signing with NBC, and stealing headlines. And make no mistake, this feud is just beginning, because the more NBC builds around Molly, the more it chips away at Stephen A's empire. ESPN knows it, NBC knows it, and Stephen A knows it too.
There was a contract negotiation that was going on. ESPN certainly did not want to lose her. But in the end, she made a decision to walk away from the show effective immediately, as you see from her Instagram post.
The fallout. Molly Qerim's leap to NBC didn't just shake up ESPN. It ignited a behind-the-scenes war. Let's start with the rumors. Multiple insiders claimed that in the days leading up to Molly's official announcement, Stephen A. Smith made a series of calls not just to ESPN executives, but to industry contacts. His mission? To find out if NBC was really serious, and some alleged to persuade them to back off. Now, to be clear, we can't prove every detail of those calls, but the whispers have been loud. One industry writer noted the unusual quiet coming from Stephen A. in the hours after Molly's news broke, speculating that he was working the phones, trying to contain a fire he didn't see coming. But here's the twist. NBC wasn't backing down. In fact, they were doubling down. Sources say NBC executives viewed Molly's signing as a strategic play, a way to finally chip away at ESPN's monopoly on morning sports talk. With the Olympics, the NFL, and Premier League soccer in their portfolio, NBC had the sports rights. What they lacked was a personality who could carry a daily debate show. Molly fit the bill perfectly, and when word reached ESPN that NBC wasn't just hiring her but building around her, panic set in. You could see it in the way ESPN immediately rotated guest moderators on First Take. One day it was Christine Williamson, the next it was Malika Andrews, then Elle Duncan. It felt like auditions because that's exactly what it was. Meanwhile, NBC wasted no time hyping Molly's arrival. Their press release called her one of the most trusted voices in sports television. They teased a new era of sports debate, and they made sure to highlight her decade of experience at ESPN, turning her resume into a trophy. That's when Stephen A snapped. Fans immediately connected the dots. He never said Molly's name, but who else fit the description? Who else just defined her own value by signing a groundbreaking deal with a rival network? It was Molly. And Stephen A's frustration was spilling into public view. But what happened off camera was even more shocking. Several outlets reported that Stephen A had a heated exchange with ESPN brass over how Molly's departure was handled. He allegedly felt blindsided, embarrassed that the show's stability was undermined without warning. One insider described him as furious, pacing, shouting, demanding answers. And the kicker? Some say he even hinted at his own future outside ESPN, that if the network couldn't protect First Take, his empire, then maybe it was time for him to consider alternatives. It was a bluff, of course. ESPN can't afford to lose Stephen A, and he knows it. But the fact that he even went there shows just how rattled Molly's move left him. Because here's the irony. For years, Stephen A has thrived on the chaos of First Take. Different co-hosts, endless arguments, rotating debates. But Molly was the one constant. She was the anchor, the moderator, the steady hand. And without her, his empire suddenly looks fragile, and NBC, they know it. That's why they've been quietly teasing that Molly's new show will launch head-to-head against First Take, a direct competitor, a daily ratings battle. Imagine the optics. Stephen A on ESPN, Molly on NBC, both live at the same time, viewers flipping back and forth, social media comparing clips, headlines dissecting who won the debate war. It's poetic. The student becomes the rival. But there's one more layer, and it's the part Stephen A. fears most. NBC isn't just offering Molly airtime, they're offering her crossover appeal. Interviews with celebrities, feature specials, even talk of a primetime project. That's the nightmare scenario for Stephen A. Because suddenly Molly isn't just his former moderator, she's his competition. And here's where it gets explosive. In the weeks after Molly's deal was announced, a leaked audio clip began circulating online. The authenticity is still debated, but in it, a voice that sounds suspiciously like Stephen A. can be heard venting to an associate. "She thinks she can do this without me. NBC going to find out real quick. It's different when you're not sitting across from Stephen A. Smith. You mark my words, they'll regret it." Again, unverified, but the timing was telling. Fans seized on it, spreading it across X, TikTok, and Reddit. The narrative took hold. Stephen A. wasn't just upset, he was bitter. And that bitterness has only fueled Molly's rise. Because the more shade Stephen A. throws, the stronger Molly looks. The more he frames her as overvaluing herself, the more NBC frames her as trailblazing. The more he insists everyone has a boss, the more Molly embodies independence. It's a PR war Stephen A. can't win. And that's why this story matters. Because it's not just about one contract or one network rivalry. It's about a shift in sports media. A shift where the so-called moderators and sidekicks are no longer content to sit quietly while the stars cash the checks. A shift where talent, especially women, demand not just seats at the table, but control of the table itself. Stephen A. Smith slammed Molly Qerim, but in the process, he revealed his fear that the empire he built at ESPN may not be as secure as it seems. And Molly, she's proving that sometimes the boldest move you can make is to walk away.